What if I told you that in 1987, tucked away inside the private papers of Charleston's elite, archivists stumbled onto a discovery so disturbing it was sealed for over a century? A leather-bound ledger, hidden, locked away, its pages yellowed with age, but inside, not crop records, not finances. No, what they found were chilling notes that read less like human history and more like livestock records. 847 entries, names, births, deaths, height measurements, family bloodlines, cold clinical evaluations of breeding potential, and the most horrifying detail of all, the final pages revealed letters exchanged between wealthy plantation owners, boasting that their selective breeding programs had produced profits 3 times higher than cotton itself. That ledger cracked open a secret network, a conspiracy so carefully orchestrated it ran for nearly 20 years without anyone outside their circle realizing. This is what became known as the Charleston breeding conspiracy. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed and drop your state in the comments. We love hearing from our community of dark history explorers. Charleston in the 1840s wasn't just rich, it was the crown jewel of the South. A city drenched in wealth from rice and cotton, its prosperity resting entirely on enslaved labor. The city's aristocratic families, the Ravenels, the Rutledges, the Pinckneys, the Draytons, had turned agriculture into a science. They rotated crops, managed soils, and bred livestock with precision. But behind closed doors, these same men were applying those scientific methods to people, and at the center of it all was a young outsider, Thomas Whitfield. His family had just purchased a modest plantation north of the city, which earned him a seat among Charleston's upper class. But unlike the others, Thomas carried with him something dangerous: sympathy for abolition. At Harvard, he'd been exposed to radical ideas about dignity and human rights. Now back home, he found himself surrounded by men whose sophistication masked unthinkable cruelty. The summer of 1843 was Thomas's first true glimpse of Charleston high society. Glittering garden parties, evenings on East Bay Street, grand mansions lit with candles and music. It was at one such gathering, inside the Ravenel mansion, that Thomas overheard whispers about something called the Breeding Initiative. At first it was fragments, snippets, of conversation about improvement, about pairings, about enhanced productivity, but the more he listened at future gatherings, the clearer and darker the picture became. The same men who proudly bred their thoroughbred horses and cattle were using those exact principles on human beings: bloodlines, traits, physical endurance, even obedience, all discussed with the kind of casual detachment you'd expect at a livestock fair. Then came the night that changed everything. December 1843. The Drayton estate glowed with lamplight for the annual harvest celebration. Charleston's elite gathered in their finery, sipping brandy and exchanging pleasantries. But Thomas wasn't there for the party. Hidden outside Colonel Drayton's study, he pressed himself against the brick wall and listened. Through the open window, what he heard made his blood run. Cold Dr. Edmund Ravenel was reading. Aloud, almost like delivering a scientific report, the results from our 3-year initiative have exceeded expectations, he announced. Millfield Plantation alone has produced 17 births from carefully selected pairings, with children averaging 2 inches taller than the previous generation and showing stronger resistance to illness. Then came Colonel Rutledge's voice. Papers rustled. The Pinckney operations, he said, have been just as successful. By focusing on docility while maintaining strength, their new generation shows 25% less resistance to instruction. Less resistance. Thomas's hand shook as he scribbled the words into his journal, and then Colonel Drayton himself spoke. What he revealed froze Thomas to the bone. This isn't just about Charleston anymore. Our network now stretches into Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia. By maintaining detailed breeding records, we're able to track bloodlines across state lines and ensure the best possible combinations. Thomas's stomach turned. These weren't isolated plantations experimenting on their own. This was an organized network, a system. Human beings treated like livestock, children bred, evaluated, and distributed based on projected capabilities. Dr. Ravenel's voice came again. Every birth must be recorded with measurements, Lineage and a value assessment. Cold, systematic, inhuman. And Thomas realized, standing outside in the December chill, that he had stumbled into one of the darkest secrets in American history. Imagine sitting in the dark outside a mansion window, your hands shaking as you scribble notes, and then hearing this. Our records now hold information on more than 800 people across the network, enough to plan breeding combinations 5 years ahead. That was the moment Thomas Whitfield realized the scale of what he was uncovering. The men inside spoke for over an hour, long enough for Thomas to fill pages in his journal. What they described wasn't just slavery. It was something colder, more organized, more terrifying. They talked about breeding houses, places where women were kept for reproduction alone, about stud selections, men chosen like prize bulls for their strength and stature. And worst of all, they spoke of children, inspected like crops. Those who met their standards were raised in specialized nurseries. But those who didn't, they were sent off to brutal agricultural fields, separated from their families, places where life expectancy was heartbreakingly short. Thomas stayed hidden until the last guest left. And by then he knew. This wasn't random cruelty. This was a coordinated enterprise, with record books, profit projections, and networks stretching across states. It was being run like any other business, except its product was human life. Walking back to his plantation that night, Thomas made a choice. He wouldn't just watch. He'd infiltrate, document, and one day expose everything. But what he didn't realize was this. What he was about to uncover would be so dark, so systematic, that even seasoned abolitionists would struggle to believe him. The weeks after that night changed Thomas forever. He moved from observer to undercover investigator. The breeding consortium, as he began to call it, wasn't easy to penetrate. Its members spoke in codes, held secret meetings at shifting locations, and locked their most incriminating records far from prying eyes. But Thomas caught a break through a friendship with William Pinckney, the youngest son of one of Charleston's founding families. William was 22, eager to prove himself and far less careful than his father. After a few drinks at the Charleston Club, William bragged about his family's advanced agricultural operations. He let slip something that made Thomas's heart race. The Pinckney estate had breeding quarters, entire buildings dedicated solely to selective reproduction, and even more critical, William boasted about having access to the master registry, a single ledger that tracked bloodlines, genetic pairings, and breeding outcomes across the entire network. If Thomas could get to that registry, he'd have the proof he needed. But getting inside the Pinckney plantation wouldn't be simple. The breeding quarters were tucked away in a remote section, heavily guarded, completely off limits to outsiders. And the registry? It was locked inside a safe in the main office, opened only by senior family members. Thomas would need a cover, and that cover came in the form of Margaret Pinckney, William's sister. At first, courting Margaret was a strategy, a way to gain access. But the plan grew complicated. Margaret was intelligent, spirited, and surprisingly progressive. She supported education reforms and questioned parts of the Southern Order. What began as calculated deception slowly turned into something real. And through Margaret, Thomas gained something priceless: entry, invitations to dinners, overnight visits, time to observe the layout, the guards, the routines. Piece by piece, he gathered information. The breeding quarters held about 40 women, ages 16 to 30, all chosen for what the Pinckneys called optimal traits. They were given slightly better food, cleaner housing, and medical attention, but only because their bodies were being treated as valuable property for reproduction. The men chosen as sires were rotated between plantations, their movements tracked to keep bloodlines diverse while ensuring the right mix of traits. Every individual in the program had detailed records: health, family lineage, even personality assessments, and the children. From the moment they were born, they were classified. The promising ones raised in nurseries, the rest sent away, ripped from their mothers, dispatched to fields where survival was a coin toss. By the spring of 1844, Thomas had learned enough to attempt something bold, maybe even reckless. Margaret let slip that her father would be leaving for Georgia to attend a regional consortium meeting. The estate would be left under the watch of an overseer, and Thomas knew this was his chance, the moment to try and get his hands on the master registry itself. What he didn't yet realize was that what he would find inside that safe would not only confirm his worst fears, but reveal something far more terrifying than he ever imagined. A thunderstorm rolling across the South Carolina low country, lightning flashing over the rice fields, and a young man, Thomas Whitfield, slipping through the shadows of the Pinckney State with one goal in mind, to uncover the truth. That May evening would become the turning point of his life. What Thomas discovered inside those walls revealed not just cruelty, but a level of organization so vast, so deliberate, it shook him to his core. The first shock came from the master registry itself. This wasn't just a Charleston operation. No, those pages contained records and letters tying together networks across Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, even as far as Mississippi. It wasn't a handful of plantations experimenting in secret. It was an enterprise, a coordinated system stretching across the entire South, and Thomas was about to see its human cost with his own eyes. The Pinckney breeding. Quarters were hidden deep within the plantation grounds, a cluster of 6 buildings built in a square around a central courtyard. Unlike the cramped, rough cabins where enslaved people usually lived, these buildings were strangely tidy, ventilated, spacious, even a little comfortable. But Thomas knew exactly why. Healthier women meant healthier births, and healthier births meant higher profits. Through a window in the main dormitory, he saw rows of neatly made beds, each one occupied, dozens of young women, silent, motionless, breathing evenly in the humid night air. It was eerie, too quiet. Later, Thomas would learn why. Every evening, these women were given mild sedatives, not for rest but to keep them compliant, to silence conversation, to prevent escape plans. The second building hit Thomas just as hard. It was outfitted like a medical clinic, though it looked more like the veterinary facilities he'd seen used on livestock examination tables. Measuring tools, charts pinned neatly on the walls, records tracked monthly cycles, diets, and detailed pregnancy schedule. Every aspect of their bodies, monitored, managed, controlled, not as people, but as assets. But the third building, that was the one Thomas would never forget. It was both nursery and evaluation center. Here, newborns were weighed, measured, observed. Their futures decided almost instantly. On the walls were charts dividing children into categories: premium stock raised for special training and care, or standard labor destined for the fields. Even babies were treated as inventory. And then there was the registry. By candlelight, Thomas flipped through its pages inside the plantation's main office. His hands trembled as he read. 1,470 individuals. Every detail logged. Family trees going back 3 generations. Pairings planned years in advance. Lineages tracked like bloodlines of racehorses. It was all there. Proof that this wasn't chance or chaos. It was deliberate, and it went deeper than he imagined. Correspondence letters filled a separate section of the register from Georgia. Reports of successful pairings. Offers to exchange stock from Virginia. New evaluation techniques. More efficient ways to judge human potential. From Mississippi. Profit projections showing breeding operations generating 3 times the revenue of cotton. 3 times. Thunder rumbled outside as Thomas copied down page after page, sweat dripping in the candlelight. For 4 hours, he worked, filling his journal with evidence. By dawn, his notes were damning, but with every letter he read, the danger grew clear. This wasn't just a few wealthy families. Judges, politicians, respected Charleston elites, men who ran churches, sat on councils, held the law in their hands, were all implicated. The very people who could have stopped this were the ones keeping it alive. That night, Thomas realized something chilling. He wasn't just documenting cruelty. He was documenting an industrial system, an attempt to turn human reproduction into a science, perfected for profit and protected by the most powerful men in the South. And as the sun rose over Charleston, he knew. His next move would decide not only his own fate, but the lives of thousands trapped inside this machine. What if I told you the evidence Thomas uncovered wasn't enough to bring this nightmare to light? Because the men behind it weren't just wealthy planners, they were powerful, connected, and ruthless. By the time Thomas slipped back across the plantation grounds in the faint hours before dawn, he knew the truth. The papers in his hands could expose everything, but taking these men down would take more than ink and words. It would take outsmarting people who had everything to lose. What Thomas didn't realize, his infiltration hadn't gone unnoticed. Someone had been watching. A young servant in the Pinckney household had already slipped word to her masters. And with that, the trap was set. The very next morning, an uninvited guest appeared at Millbrook Estate. Colonel Drayton, one of the network's most influential members, strolled in like he owned the place. But he wasn't alone. With him came two men Thomas had never seen before. One was introduced as Dr. Samuel Huger, supposedly an expert in plantation security. The other, just Mr. Crawford, cold eyes, scarred hands. A man who looked more like a killer than a farmer. Imagine sitting at your own breakfast table, knowing every word you spoke could decide whether you lived or died. That's exactly where Thomas found himself. Drayton's opening remarks dripped with Southern politeness, but the message beneath them was sharp as a blade. Thomas, we've noticed someone poking around in our private business affairs. That sort of curiosity can be dangerous. Dr. Huger leaned forward, his voice as clinical as the breeding charts Thomas had seen in the quarters. We believe someone has been documenting private conversations, even accessing confidential records. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Thomas kept his composure, but inside his pulse thundered. He knew if he denied too hard, they'd see through it. If he confessed, he'd never leave that table alive. So he gambled. He acted confused, then flipped the script. Gentlemen, he said carefully, I've actually had the same concerns. I've overheard strange conversations myself, talk of breeding protocols, new agricultural experiments. It's had me wondering if someone's been spying on you, maybe even federal agents. The room shifted. Drayton and Huger glanced at each other. For a moment they hesitated. Was Thomas a threat? Or someone who could be useful? Dr. Huger finally broke the silence. Thomas, you clearly understand what's at stake. These aren't just ordinary agricultural practices. They're revolutionary methods. Methods our enemies would twist and destroy if they knew the truth. But then the real hammer fell. Crawford, silent until now, leaned forward. His words were calm but carried the weight of a death sentence. Mr. Whitfield, we know you accessed the Pinckney registry. We have a witness who saw you. You copied documents. You now hold information that could ruin families, destroy entire operations. Thomas's heart sank. They had him, completely. But instead of killing him outright, they made an offer, a chilling one. Join them, become part of the network, contribute his plantation to their breeding enterprise, lend his Harvard-trained mind to their so-called science, or face the consequences. The choice wasn't spelled out, but Crawford's presence made the alternative crystal clear. 2 hours passed in that suffocating room. By the end of it, Thomas knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just holding evidence anymore. He was holding his own life in the balance, and here's the haunting part. He asked for time to consider their proposal, because deep down he understood. One wrong move and he wouldn't live to see another dawn. Just when you thought this story couldn't get darker, the Charleston conspiracy tightens its grip. What would you do if the only way to expose a secret this big was to sit in the same room with the very men who could have you killed? That was the position Thomas found himself in. He had the evidence, enough to bring the network down, but evidence alone wasn't enough. Not when his enemies controlled the courts, the politicians, even the sheriffs. To survive, Thomas would have to outsmart them on their own turf. 3 days after their ultimatum, he gave them his answer. On the surface, it looked like acceptance. He walked into a private room above Henderson's Tavern in Charleston carrying a leather portfolio, claiming it held designs to turn Millbrook Estate into a full-scale breeding facility. In truth, it carried something far more explosive. The tavern itself had been carefully chosen by the conspirators. Discreet, multiple exits, no unwanted ears. What they didn't know was that Marcus Henderson, the tavern's owner and a free black man, was secretly helping Thomas. He had planted listening devices throughout the room to record every word of what was about to unfold. Inside, the most powerful men of the network gathered, Colonel Drayton, Dr. Huger, Crawford, and 7 more members of their inner circle. For them, this was a celebration. A Harvard-educated recruit bringing not just his plantation, but his brilliance into their operations. Expensive brandy was poured. Congratulations filled the air. Then came the presentations. Dr. Huger, proud of their achievements, revealed more than Thomas had ever suspected. Charts, data, medical diagrams, proof of just how advanced their programs had become. They weren't just pairing enslaved people like livestock. They had ties to medical colleges. Professors at the University of Georgia, the College of Charleston, even Harvard Medical School had been advising them. Letters of support from respected scientists gave their crimes a cloak of legitimacy. To the outside world, this wasn't slavery. It was agricultural science, but the reality was horrifying. Psychological testing, education programs to shape children into profitable products, medical procedures designed to boost fertility and survival rates. Every piece of it laid out in clinical detail. Even Thomas, who thought he'd seen the worst, was stunned. For nearly 2 hours, he played his role, enthusiastic, grateful, convinced. He showed them architectural sketches for converting his estate into specialized breeding quarters, nurseries, examination rooms, genetic record centers. The drawings were so convincing that several men begged for copies. He even dangled promises of expansion. Said he'd been in touch with plantation owners in Texas and Arkansas, territories with cheap land and almost no oversight. The idea electrified the room. Profits, growth. A southern empire built on human lives. Then came the moment he'd been building toward. Thomas flipped open a second section of his portfolio. His voice steady, though his heart pounded. "Gentlemen," he said, "these documents show not only my grasp of your methods, but improvements that surpass even what you've built." They leaned in, eager to see. But what Thomas pulled out wasn't a blueprint for his estate. It was their own records, copied pages from the master registry, breeding schedules, financial projections, private correspondence. Every secret they had fought to protect, now laid out on the table before them. And in that instant, the tone of the meeting shifted. What happened next would turn celebration into chaos. What if the proof you risked everything to collect could finally expose a secret so monstrous, but also paint a target on your back the size of Charleston itself? That's where Thomas found himself. Spread across the table, page after page, was evidence no one could deny. Detailed breeding assignments, profit ledgers, letters showing coordination between states, expansion plans into new territories, even medical charts and genetic records that broke human lives down into statistics, and the worst part? The numbers didn't lie. Over the last 5 years, this network had pulled in more than $800,000, money they used to buy politicians, silence sheriffs, and grease the wheels of their expansion. For the first time, the men around that table realized Thomas hadn't come to join them. He had come to destroy them. The silence shattered when Crawford lunged, his hand reaching for the pistol under his coat. But Thomas was ready. That stylish walking stick he always carried, it wasn't just for show. With a sudden strike, he cracked Crawford across the wrist, hard enough to send the pistol clattering across the floor. And that was just the beginning. From downstairs came the crash of breaking glass. It was Marcus Henderson, the tavern's owner, triggering the signal. Outside, allies, freed blacks, abolitionists, even sympathetic locals moved into position. What looked like Thomas being cornered was actually a trap years in the making. The private room erupted into chaos. Dr. Huger scrambled for the scattered documents. Drayton barked orders to seal the exits. But one by one they realized they were surrounded. Every escape route had already been covered. Witnesses were recording, copying, securing evidence. Thomas fought toward the window, clutching the most damning records against his chest. His stick kept attackers at bay as he crashed through the glass, tumbling into the alley below. But here's the twist. This wasn't just an escape. Thomas had planned for this moment. Copies of the evidence were already hidden across the city. Even if he died, the truth would live on. On Charleston's waterfront, the battle spilled into the streets. To outsiders, it looked like a desperate chase. But in reality, it was a carefully staged operation to drag the network's secrets into the open. At the docks, a boat waited, not just for flight, but for exposure. Hidden inside were printing tools and extra copies of the registry. Abolitionist couriers were already distributing pages throughout the city. By the time the conspirators realized it, it was too late. And then, the final standoff. Crawford emerged from the shadows, pistol in hand, backed by 8 men Thomas knew all too well. Not nameless thugs, Charleston's finest, judges, planters, men he'd once shared polite dinners with. "Mr. Whitfield," Crawford said coldly, "this ends tonight. The papers die with you, but Thomas didn't flinch. He simply smiled, lifted the documents high, and gestured around them. Because surrounding the docks weren't just enemies, there were witnesses. Dozens of them. "Gentlemen," Thomas declared, his voice cutting through the night, "it's already too late. Copies of this evidence are in the hands of journalists, federal investigators, and abolitionist leaders in 6 cities. Your secrets aren't secrets anymore." And in that single moment, the hunters became the hunted. The men who had built their empire on silence and shadows suddenly found themselves dragged into the light. What happened next would determine not just Thomas's fate, but the future of hundreds enslaved inside that breeding network. What happened next on that Charleston dock is still debated to this day. Witnesses told different versions. But one thing's certain, the ripple effects reached far beyond the harbor that night, shaking Southern society, rattling Congress, and fueling the storm that would eventually lead America toward civil war. Thomas was cornered, armed men in front of him, powerful families behind them. But instead of surrendering or making a hopeless stand, he did something no one expected. He started reading aloud, not from his own notes, but from the network's own secret records. Names, dates, transactions, breeding assignments. The kind of evidence that not only incriminated the men pointing pistols at him, but exposed dozens of their allies across South Carolina and neighboring states. His voice carried across the harbor. Sailors stopped what they were doing. Dock workers froze. People leaned out of windows, listening in stunned silence as he peeled back the curtain on practices most had never imagined were possible. Every word he spoke created new witnesses, and suddenly the men who had once controlled the room found themselves trapped. Because now silencing Thomas would only prove everything he'd just revealed, and Thomas didn't stop there. He revealed connections to slave traders who specialized in selective stock. He exposed ties to respected doctors, universities, and even politicians who had lent legitimacy to these horrific programs. Family names, big names, were read aloud, linked to financial records and correspondence that made denial nearly impossible. Imagine standing in that crowd, some freed blacks, some former slaves, even white citizens who suddenly realized their own family's tragedies had roots in this very network. The shock was overwhelming. The whispers turned to anger, and the elite men facing Thomas realized the trap had snapped shut. Charleston constables eventually arrived, summoned by the growing commotion. But they were stuck. They couldn't easily protect their powerful superiors because dozens, maybe hundreds, of ordinary witnesses had already heard the truth. And Thomas, calm and deliberate, handed over the documents himself, knowing the evidence was now far too public to ever be buried. Of course, the conspirators tried damage control. Dr. Huger, desperate to save face, called the records forgeries, blaming abolitionist propaganda. But the details were too precise, too specific, and worse, some in the crowd recognized the names, dates, and events firsthand. That independent confirmation destroyed any hope of dismissing the evidence. Within hours, copies of the documents were already moving through abolitionist networks. Newspapers in Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, even Philadelphia received packets of proof. What began as a dockside confrontation exploded into a national scandal. Charleston's elite panicked. Some families tried to disown their involvement. Others doubled down on denial, and a few destroyed records in frantic attempts to erase their guilt. But secrecy had been the lifeblood of the breeding network, and once it was gone, the entire enterprise collapsed in on itself. Investors lost fortunes. Slave traders lost their markets. Even buyers stopped purchasing enslaved people linked to exposed operations, destroying the economic foundation of the program. And behind all this chaos was Thomas, who vanished from Charleston in the days that followed. Not running, but extracted, moved north through safe houses until he reached Philadelphia, where he worked with journalists and federal investigators to dig even deeper. His insider knowledge became the backbone of investigations that uncovered similar operations across Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina. Meanwhile, the network fought dirty. Witnesses were bribed, threatened, some even vanished. But every intimidation attempt only made investigators more certain of their guilt. Their cover-ups left new paper trails, their relocations exposed more properties, and the sudden collapse of fortunes made their guilt obvious. Some families never recovered. The Pinckneys, for example, Margaret collapsed into despair when she learned the truth of Thomas's courtship. Her brother William broke ranks and gave evidence to save himself, and their once proud name dissolved in scandal. Dr. Huger's career was destroyed too. His correspondence with medical schools revealing just how far respected institutions had gone to provide scientific justification for crimes against humanity. In the end, the Charleston breeding network didn't fall because of a courtroom conviction. It fell because secrecy became impossible. Their great strength, organization, coordination, legitimacy, turned into their greatest weakness under the glare of public exposure. Thomas Whitfield disappeared into history until papers surfaced in the 1920s, showing that he survived and spent the rest of his life aiding the Underground Railroad. His records, the ones he risked everything to copy, became some of the most powerful evidence abolitionists ever carried into Congress. And here's the haunting part. Charleston wasn't unique. Modern historians now believe similar networks operated across the South, many better at destroying their paper trails. Tens of thousands of enslaved lives may have been shaped by these hidden breeding programs, systems, so cold and calculated they treated reproduction itself as an industrial process. The Charleston scandal was just one glimpse, but it was enough to shatter illusions, fuel abolitionist fire, and remind us what happens when entire societies choose to normalize cruelty under the mask of science and respectability. So what do you think? Do you believe everything really came out that night? Or are there still secrets buried in Charleston's past?